Okay, so now why the human sexuality course is important. So we've already talked about it being more complex and we may be wrong in our knowledge. But also, taking a course like this really helps us to build tolerance and respect for sexual diversity. You're going to learn about things in this class that maybe you kind of know a little bit about, but don't know that much because it's not something that you do and you don't know that many people who do it. And so this can be a really informative class that'll really broaden your knowledge base about things. A lot of times we fear things that we don't understand. And so if you have insight into variations in sexual behavior or sexual desires and things like that, it can make you a little bit more tolerant. Maybe you can at least respect other people who have different approaches. My goal is to help you to form your own personal set of morals. And so it might not be the case that you will switch from having a negative attitude towards some set of behaviors and shift over to positive, and in fact, you're going to start engaging in those behaviors. Instead, what I'm hoping is that maybe you can start to move more into the neutral area where you're just like, okay, people do different things. For me, these are the things that I value. These are the things that are important to me. And you can develop your own moral code because we all should understand what we all personally think and want to do for ourselves. And that gets us to the issue of sexual health. If you know what your morals are and what you value, it's more likely to be that you'll behave in ways that are consistent with your own morals and values. And so it's less likely that you'll find yourself swept away in a sexual scenario and end up with an STI or something like that. It's less likely that you'll regret decisions that you make later on in life if you are really clear on what's important to you. And then I'd like to say someday, some of you don't have kids yet, probably a lot of you don't, but someday in the future you probably will. Most people, it's like a 90% rate of people who have children someday. So probably most of you will one day have children, and just think, by having more knowledge, you'll feel more confident and maybe even more comfortable talking to your own children about things and sharing your viewpoints, which is really important. In a survey of teenagers reported that they would prefer to get their sexual information from their parents. They would rather not have to go look on the internet or talk to their friends or have to learn it in school. They'd rather have conversations with their parents. And part of the reason why parents don't talk to their kids is because they're embarrassed, or they're not sure that they know. They might have the information wrong. So I'd recommend you keep this text, and someday in the future, if you have children, whip it out and show them some stuff. I've made my children variously read different chapters at different stages in their lives, and so that you don't even have to be the one who totally talks to them. You can share a book, and that's a great thing. And the last thing I wanted to talk about is what is so-called normal sexually. We don't use the word normal as a judgment in research or in science topics. We use the word normal to mean common. A lot of times you hear people say the word normal and you almost kind of cringe because it feels like they're saying good or desirable or right. But in this context, the word normal is referring to this curve. This is called a normal curve. You've got the mean right there at 50, and you've got 68% of people falling within that royal blue area. That's the definition of a normal curve. And then you've got 95% of people falling within 2 standard deviations away from the mean. When we talk about normal, we're talking about that set of behaviors, that response, that outcome that 95% of people do. Now, of course, there are people in the outlying ends, and they may not be being represented by the phrase normal. Now, then automatically our brains go to that, what's the opposite of normal? Abnormal. And then our brains go, abnormal? That sounds bad. I don't want to be abnormal. People probably don't like abnormal people. But abnormal does not necessarily mean bad. It just means different, right? It means not in the norm. So for example, I'm a 1%er because I'm deathly allergic to fire ants, and got bit by 2 of them when I lived in Florida and nearly died of anaphylactic shock. So am I bad because I'm in that category of people who is deathly allergic to fire ants? No, it's just a neutral thing that's a fact of my life, right? Do I go to Florida anymore? No. But I kind of have to stay out of the entire, southeast. But I am not common. I'm unusual. Everybody else in the world can walk in sandals in Florida, get bit by a fire ant, and just go, "Ow, that really hurt," and kill the fire ant, and move on with their lives. I have to whip out an EpiPen. It's a big thing, right? Okay, I'm giving you this as an example because there are a lot of things that we're going to talk about in this course that are, some people, like a very small number of people, are in this category. And it doesn't make them bad, it just makes them different. It just makes them, and only for that thing it makes them different. It doesn't make them then different in every other way. I'm not also allergic to bees, and also allergic to gluten, and also allergic to a whole bunch of other stuff. I'm allergic to the one thing, right? So one thing makes me different from everybody else, but I have a lot more in common with everybody else, or with a lot of people, than I have uncommon with them. And that's the same thing with the stuff we're going to be talking about. So if I ever slip and use the word normal rather than average or common, I don't mean it as a judgment in any way, shape, or form. So let's talk a little bit about how we study human sexuality, and really why we need to waste our time talking about these methods at all in this class. I really want to encourage your critical thinking. There is so much information shared with us about the results of research on the news or on the radio or on the internet. You see stuff all the time about what researchers have found. I just saw an announcement that they found a big old extra aquifer under California today. So I right away thought, how did they suddenly find this extra aquifer in California? And I did what a good critical thinker does, and I looked up sources that were a little bit more scientific rather than newsworthy, and found out what they were talking about. That's kind of the thinking I'd like you to go through. You don't necessarily have to go look up the original article to find out, all the details, but maybe find a more scientific source to give you a little bit more detail, and that would be a great thing. Because there are so many studies cited all the time that we're inundated with it. And then, of course, it's in our textbooks, right? And so as you're reading your textbook, it's good for you to know some of the basic issues, basic design concerns that will influence the meaningfulness of the results being reported. So, some basic issues. I wanted to take a second and talk about respondents. In the olden days, we used to call these participants, so I use those terms interchangeably. We've started to call them respondents more because we do so many surveys in human sexuality, and people respond on surveys, so we call them respondents. When we get a group of people to participate in our study, one of the biggest concerns is whether their answers or their behaviors or their responses can be generalized to other people outside the study. Because it's really not that interesting to just do a study and now we understand these 10 people who responded, right? We'd rather use those 10 people as a model for other people. I chose this picture as my illustration of what generalizability means because, they kind of look like they're all wearing the same shirt almost. They look very similar. They're all reasonably close to the same age. They all have dark hair and reasonably light skin. And they just all kind of look like college students. Now, if I conducted a study using this group of people, I would want to make sure in my report on the study that I described who the participants were, who the respondents were, so that other people would realize, okay, these were college students, maybe we shouldn't generalize to people who are significantly older or younger, that these people were within an age bracket, so and people were from a particular region of the country. You might be reading your text and he might say, Hawk might say, this study was conducted at the University of Georgia, and you might think, I don't care, skim over. The reason why he's telling you it was conducted at the University of Georgia is so that you realize that it's from the Southeast and that maybe it doesn't represent all Americans. And that it was done at a university, so you realize maybe it doesn't represent people who have never been to university or college. So that you can kind of think about how much weight to give to the findings. The other thing about respondents is that, of course, we're not allowed to kidnap people and make them be in our studies, and so they have to volunteer. I chose this picture to illustrate what the volunteer bias means, because you've got all these people who have their hands down, they're not willing to participate, and then there's the one guy who has his hand up, and you'll notice that he looks different from them. This picture is sort of illustrating that the person who agrees to participate might be somehow fundamentally different from all the people who refuse to participate. you guys have probably answered the phone and it's been a poll taker of some sort, some kind of survey that they wanted you to take, and you've hung up. And then there were other people who stayed on the phone and answered. Or maybe you're in the other category. I tend to answer polls because, I'm a researcher, so I always feel like, good karma will come from participating. And that makes me different from all the people who hung up. I mean, the first thing is I'm a researcher. So I'm like, sure, I'll do your survey. Well, I have more education probably than the average respondent. I'm probably different in a lot of demographic issues than all the other people who they called. And so we have to always be aware that whenever you see the results of, even when it's like 3,000 people who participated, it's 3,000 people who volunteered to participate, and there's probably some subset of people who refused. And we always have to wonder, I wonder if I'm more like the people who agreed to participate, or I'm actually more like the people who refused. And maybe I should take this with a little grain of salt. So participants or respondents is one issue. The reliability of the study, that like, could you produce the same results again, is another basic issue, and validity is another basic issue. Is this study actually producing accurate results? I figured that the best way to illustrate these two concepts is to show you this interesting picture I found on the internet. So on the left, we have a study that has produced reliable results, but they're not valid. They're nowhere near the target. So we got this nice cluster. They're all producing the same basic outcome, but they're not really studying what they think they're studying. So they think they're studying people's attitudes about premarital sex, but really what the participants are getting is, I don't know, they actually are perceiving it to be a survey of defying your parents. I don't know. And so they really aren't, they're answering the questions from a whole different perspective, and we're not validly measuring what we think we're measuring. Now the second one in there, the low validity, low reliability, you see that they're sort of around the target, they're around the bullseye, but they're not hitting it. And you see that they aren't really even clustering together very well. So they're not producing the same result every time. And they're not getting very close to the bullseye on any of these shots, really. So it's low in validity. It's not really measuring what it's claiming to measure. And it's low in reliability. They're not even producing consistent results. Now, in the third one, we've got not reliable, and it's not valid. Again, we're not hitting the target. At least all the shots are sort of above the target, so at least they're always shooting high, right? So they're kind of all making some similar mistake in their design that's producing the lack of validity, but it's not reliable or valid. What we're going for is what's over there on the right. See, imagine that each of those spots, instead of being an arrow that has already hit, imagine that it's a study that's been conducted. And they're all sort of circling around the target. Some of them have actually hit the bullseye and are literally measuring what they claim to measure. Others are kind of pretty close to measuring what they claim to measure, but they're not right quite on a target. But they're all clustering together. That's what we would like to see in our research, is reliable research that is validly measuring what it's claiming to measure. And it's really hard to achieve. It's surprisingly hard to achieve. I have done so many studies that turn out not to be valid. They aren't measuring or producing what I expected. And then I repeat the exact same design, trying for some, well, maybe it was those subjects or something, and I get a different outcome. And so then I discover it's not reliable or valid. This is horrible. It happens a lot in human sexuality. So let's get to the methods. The most common method by far of collecting data in human sexuality is to do a survey. Now, there are different kinds of surveys that we can administer. Historically, over time, the most popular has been the written questionnaire, where you're actually given a piece of paper and you actually make check marks on the piece of paper and you return it to the researcher. It could be mailed to your house. You fill it out and you're supposed to mail it back. It could be administered in a classroom. We could take those college students on my previous slide and give them all a questionnaire to complete. So it used to be really, really the most common way of collecting data because it's quick, it's inexpensive, and it's easy to score. So it all worked out pretty nicely. Then the phone became really popular, and so people started doing telephone interviews where instead of you having to read the questions, I'd read them to you, and then I'd mark down your answers. But that's pretty expensive and time consuming, and there's a high refusal rate where people will hang up on you. Face-to-face interviews are almost harder because you have to schedule a time to get together with the person and ask them questions. One benefit of interviews over written questionnaires is that you can ask follow-up questions in interviews that you can't do in written questionnaires. So if you feel like maybe the person is dodging the question or hedging, something like that, you could ask a follow-up question to make sure that you're really understanding their answers. So that's an advantage, but they are time-consuming and really expensive, so they aren't the most popular method. Today, what's becoming the most popular method is internet surveys. I used to be really, really skeptical of internet surveys, mostly because you don't know whether the respondents are really who they claim to be. So I might get an answer from, a 42-year-old male that was really prepared by a 23-year-old female who was trying to get some more extra credit in my class, right? So I always worry about whether I'm actually surveying the person that I think I'm surveying. But it is so convenient and so inexpensive and so quick to do internet surveys that you can get even more participants, and they should wash out or cover up any people who are faking it, people who are not really responding. And they've become, I'd say they've taken over, they've surpassed the popularity of the written questionnaire. Internet surveys have become pretty much the gold standard in my field, at least. And they're so easy to administer. You can put a link up on, let's say that you want to get the opinions of people who have a furry fetish. I'm not talking about just generalized furriness. I'm talking about a furry fetish where they go to conventions, not general conventions, but the kind where they literally, it's a sex convention and people wear, plush costumes and they rub on each other and like this. It's a pretty small population of people. So if you wanted to survey them using a written questionnaire, you'd have to find them, know where they live, mail it to them, or it could be really hard to recruit enough participants. So with the advent of internet surveys, what we can do is just put a link on a chat board where people who have this fetish come to talk to each other, find out where there's going to be meetups and stuff like that. You could actually put a link on that board and invite people to participate. That's really helped us to get insight into really small population groups that previously had been really just impossible to find enough people to actually do research on. So that's a big advantage of internet surveys. All right, some famous surveys. How about the Kinsey reports? Alfred Kinsey, I tried to find a flattering picture of him, so interpret that however you want. In 1948, he started doing interviews of men of all different types. And we'll talk about this survey more when it's appropriate, the different topics. So all sorts of different men, all sorts of different questions about their sexual behavior. And he published a report in 1948 called Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. He followed that up with a sexual behavior in the human female, which was also based on, a survey method and, the same basic protocol, but now he did it with women. In 1953, a book was published called Oh, Dr. Kinsey, which was a series of photographs of people reacting to the stuff that was in the Kinsey reports. And, imagine in 1953 reading one of these two books that's describing masturbation, that's describing, sexual position preferences. I mean, just all sorts of stuff. It would be very titillating stuff, I think, for a lot of people, and kind of shocking, right? He was ultimately on the cover of Time magazine and was considered, just a pioneer in the area of research on human sexuality. Of course, a lot of people thought he was studying these topics because he had some kind of fetish or was a pervert or all these things, and he's always been a controversial figure, and we'll talk more about him in other chapters, but just for now, he was like the first person who really did surveys on these topics. Now, there are some problems with surveys. One big problem is how you word the questions can affect the answers. Like, for example, these were two different polls. One poll asked, should abortion be prohibited? And another poll asked, should the life of an unborn baby be protected? And way more people agreed with the should the life of an unborn baby be protected question than agreed with the should abortion be prohibited question. Um, psychologists actually studied this question to try and figure out what factors went into the greater agreement to the second question than to the first. And a couple of things are really important. Of course, we could start off with the obvious, which is these are not parallel questions. These are not really asking the same thing, because the second one includes more than abortion. It includes things like prenatal care and advising women to wear their seatbelts and all sorts of things. So these really aren't equivalent. But if we just analyze the first question and focus in on the wording, it has two inflammatory words. One is abortion, and that's one of those, we call it inflammatory because it immediately just gets people's emotions going. And they either want to support abortion or get rid of abortion, and they may answer the question completely based on sort of like a political orientation. And then there's another inflammatory word, which is the word prohibited. Americans really don't like words like that. They don't like prohibited, they don't like denied, they don't like restricted, they don't like any of those kinds of words. So you're always going to get fewer people to agree to questions that have words like prohibited in it than words that questions that have words like enhanced or fulfilled or protected, things like that. So those two are a good example of wording problems. How about this one? People grow up in all different types of families. What type of family did you grow up in? This one suffers from limited response choices, right? I mean, there are other kinds of families besides these three structures. And so if you're going to force participants to respond, you may get an incorrect picture because they're sort of like, well, I guess I'll have to go with this one, and it doesn't really accurately represent their family structure. Then there's this one. Now, these are clearly the same exact question. Which do you prefer to use, condoms or birth control pills or condoms? But you can get people to say birth control pills more if you put it in the second position and condoms more if you put it in the second position. So you can change the answers that people are going to give when you give a list by putting the one that you want them to pick in the last position. So one of the things we do in research is correct for these things. We make sure to check, and double check for any kind of inflammatory phrasing, any biased language. We try and make sure that we think of every single response option that's possible, or we leave an other blank where the person can fill in their structure because we might have forgotten to think of that structure, family structure. And then in the final example, we do what's called counterbalancing. So half the participants see condoms first and half the participants see birth control pills first, so that we can get rid of that tendency to just pick the second one. Okay, so when we do a survey, you've got the population that you would like to generalize to. But obviously, we can never get every single member of that population, even if we tried. We couldn't poll the entire population. So we're always going to select some kind of sample and then try and generalize to the population from that sample. To increase the probability that the sample actually is representative of the population, we try and use random sampling. But we're not allowed to kidnap people and make them participate in our studies. So our random sampling techniques might not always work. We may randomly sample a number of households, but not all of them will agree to participate. Not all the people that we invite to participate will participate. That's what we call self-selection bias or volunteer bias. So because people have to volunteer, we get oftentimes a biased sample. And so that is going to reduce the generalizability of our responses. Other issues, the social desirability effect. Sometimes when people take surveys, they don't tell us what they really think. They tell us an answer that they think will make them look better. So when we ask people, I mentioned on the Kinsey survey that it's hard to know how many people have actually had extramarital affairs, because sometimes people will inflate and they'll say they have had an affair when they really haven't because they think that makes them look cool or something. Or they might deflate. They might say they never have done something that they really have because they want to look socially desirable. So that's always a concern when we're asking people about sexual behaviors. Okay, so what else can we do? Well, we could do a case study. A case study is when you study one individual in really great depth and try to get to understand that person really, really thoroughly. Now, one of the problems with this method is that the researcher may be expecting certain things from their respondent. I've got a picture of Freud here because he used the case study method really heavily. But he also imposed his interpretation of what his participants said. He kept really copious notes of their responses, and then he interpreted their responses. And a lot of people have said, maybe that's not what the participant really meant by what they said. Maybe that's what Freud wanted to hear from them. And so we call those researcher expectancy effects, where the researcher views the responses through a lens that makes the responses look different than they really were. The other problem with case study is that it's what we call anecdotal evidence. The person is reporting to us all the things that has happened to them in their lives that may not be representative of other people and may not even be accurate for this individual. I put this little picture. The plural of anecdote is not data. So we don't have any control over the person's previous experiences before they came here. We don't have any ability really to verify that the stuff that they're telling us is true. And so it's pretty dicey data. The purpose of case studies in modern research is to sort of establish what happened to one person who belongs to a rare population. For example, a person who's developed multiple personality disorders, through case studies, they've discovered that almost every person who currently suffers from multiple personality disorder has some kind of abuse that happened to them when they were very little, probably before they even learned to talk. So by doing a series of different case studies of rare populations, we may be able to establish patterns across all the different case studies. Also, sometimes case studies can be really useful for very common behaviors, things that everybody does. And so with like sexual responding and things like that, having individual cases can be okay because most people go through these same processes. And it can be a lot less expensive than trying to recruit a lot of people. So case studies can be useful. They shouldn't be the end. Another tricky technique is observation. It sounds like a simple thing. I'll just go watch people do things, but it's actually pretty complex. There's the clinical observation, which Masters and Johnson engaged in, and we're going to talk about them more when we get to sexual responding. But they actually brought people into the lab, hooked them up to machines to detect when the penis was becoming engorged with blood or the vagina was lubricating, things like that, and studied human sexual responding. That kind of observation is difficult to recruit participants for, as you can probably imagine, and it's costly and time-consuming. Participant observation is another tricky one to do. I've got the example of Humphrey's study of basically quick anonymous sex in public places. He engaged in what's called participant observation, where he was going to observe people who were engaging in quick anonymous sex by pretending like he was one of the people who was having quick anonymous sex. He acted as the lookout in the bathroom while his colleague would have quick anonymous sex in the bathroom stall. And then after the real person, the real participant, left the bathroom, Humphreys would look out the bathroom window and record that person's license plate number. And then he'd go to the public record and look up all sorts of information about the person. Does he own a business? Is he married? I'd say he, because he only studied males. Does he own a home? And he was also able to find the person's home address. And this is where it gets really super creepy. If you're creeped out so far, stick with me, because then he would go to their house and, under the guise of an entirely unrelated survey, ask them questions. Participant observations can be really tricky ethically because the people who were participating did not know that they were being included in a study. An ethical researcher would tell them. And then finally we have naturalistic observation. I've got an example of Fraley and Shaver's research on couples who were saying goodbye at the airport. And in a naturalistic observation, hopefully the people who are being observed don't realize that they're being observed. So they're behaving completely naturally. And so we can get information about, how on average people, at least at this airport, during the time frame that I was watching, how people said goodbye, right? So different types of observational techniques. There's a lot of research that's using what we call a correlational technique, which is where you use data that comes from a survey, or data that comes from a case study, or data that comes from an observational method, and you actually compute a statistic to determine whether two different variables actually predict each other. So for example, people who have more sexual partners tend to contract more STIs. That's a correlation. I got that from the CDC's website. Homosexual adults tend to report having engaged in gender atypical play as children. Got that from a study from 2010. Couples in long-term relationships tend to share values, opinions, and personalities. I got that from a study in 2014. So here, let's focus on that last one. People in long-term relationships tend to share values. I'm going to assume these people have been together for a long time. So they share similar values, opinions, and personalities. We've got the couple staying together for a long time. This demonstration is going to illustrate why we can never conclude that one thing caused the other when we have a correlation. It's possible that the cause, if there is one, could flow either way. It's possible that sharing similar values, opinions, and personalities causes you to stay together longer. Or it's possible that the longer you stay together, the more in line your values, opinions, and personalities will become. So we don't know which way it flows. All we know is that they go together. And so that's why we say that correlation doesn't equal causation. So it could flow either direction. There's also the third variable problem that limits our ability to assume causation. It's possible that some third variable, like having similar backgrounds, causes the couple to stay together. Maybe they both value it to the same level because they have similar values. And then also causes them to have similar values, opinions, and personalities because they have similar backgrounds. We don't know in a correlation whether there's some third variable that's actually the important factor. And so whenever you hear about correlations, no matter how compelling those correlations were on my previous slide, we always have to remember that's a correlation. We don't know why those two things go together. The only way that we could establish why is to do experimental research. This is fairly rare in human sexuality research because it's really hard to be able to get control over all the variables. I picked this study, an eye-gazing study from 1989, where they recruited heterosexual students to get into cross-sex, what we call dyads, partnerships, and they were assigned to gaze into each other's eyes. Well, one group was. They were all told that this was a study of whether they could read each other's minds. And so some of the participants were told to get into ESP tune with each other, they needed to stare into each other's eyes. Other participants were told that they had to stare at each other's hands to get into tune with each other. After the staring part was over, they were taken into separate rooms and they were given a questionnaire about a bunch of stuff. And in the questionnaire, they were asked how attractive they thought their partner was. So in that study, we have independent variables and we have dependent variables. So the independent variable in the eye-gazing study was whether you were staring at the partner's eyes or you were staring at the partner's hands. That was being controlled by the experimenter. So you were assigned stare to each other's eyes. You were assigned stare to each other's hands. And then the dependent variable was the score on the attractiveness scale that the partners filled out. That's the dependent variable. It should depend on which condition you were in, eye gazing or hand staring. And what they found was that people who stared into each other's eyes rated their partner as more attractive than people who stared at each other's hands. So we've got the experimental group who were assigned to gaze into each other's eyes. And then, I forgot we had a second control group in this design. Sorry, I forgot that. I think I just hit the microphone. I apologize for that noise. So we had two control groups. One stared at each other's hands. The other one counted the eye blinks. So they weren't really staring into each other's eyes. They were just counting the eye blinks. And what they found is that the eye-gazing couples found each other more attractive than the ones who did either of the control tasks. So now we know that gazing into each other's eyes causes you to find your partner more attractive than if you're just with them and staring at their hands or you're counting their eye blinks. Only through experiments can we have that kind of confidence. But you can imagine it's hard to come up with experiments for a lot of different human sexuality questions, isn't it? So experimental research allows for cause and effect. Awesome. All right. Now, I just wanted to wrap up with a little bit of a nod to the issues of ethics. I kind of talked about that a little bit with participant observer, but any researcher needs to have the well-being of the participant at the forefront of their minds. So step one, we want to make sure that we're not harming them in any way. We don't want them to possibly be exposed to the general community as somebody to be judged or maligned or to have their job eliminated or anything like that. We don't want to harm them in those ways. We don't want to harm them psychologically. We don't want to make them feel bad. We don't want to harm them physically, obviously. So we have to make sure that we're designing studies that are not going to harm our participants. We want to secure informed consent whenever possible. With the observational methods, sometimes that's not possible. But with every other method, you're supposed to let the participant know that they're going to be in a study, and and give them the basic gist of what the study is going to be about, and give them the opportunity to decline participation. Informed consent, you have to tell them enough, and then you have to give them the opportunity to consent or not. Give them the freedom, even if they have previously consented, to withdraw later if they start to realize that this is not something that they really want to do. I've had students who have started to participate in one of my studies that involves rating behaviors for sexual intent, and they'll start on the vignettes, and then they'll decide, you know what, I really don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. And they don't even have to give me an excuse. You can just say, I don't want to do this anymore. And they're allowed to withdraw. They still get whatever I promised them. I always promise extra credit. But they're allowed to withdraw. You can't make them stay. Wait, you started. You have to. The experiment demands that you continue. You can't do that to participants. You have to ensure their confidentiality. You have to make sure that their name doesn't get tied to any of their responses in any of your presentations or publications. You can't ever tell anybody that person even participated in your study. That's a tricky thing when you're giving students credit, because you have to keep their participation separate from the method that they're getting credit. So the researcher doesn't know who said what or did what. It's really a complex thing. A good researcher makes sure to ensure confidentiality. And then at the end, you're supposed to tell them basically what the study was about. You have to debrief them. Now, you don't necessarily have to tell them every single detail about the study, because they might go tell other potential participants what the study's about. But you have to give them enough detail that they'll feel like their participation was valid, worthwhile, meaningful. And then you can always tell them the full design will be revealed after the data collection is over with. And I do that all the time, and I'll announce to the whole class what it's about. Sometimes I have an ongoing study, and I can't even at the end of the quarter tell participants what it's about. And so I'll have to tell them, I can forward you the results when we're done. So sometimes it can be a really long time that you're waiting. So the basic ethics of research are these, and any good researcher is supposed to keep these in mind. By the way, if you're a researcher at a university or a college, you are supposed to go through an ethics board whose sole purpose is to make sure that the participants are protected. So usually participants have two levels, an ethical researcher and then a board that actually reviews the researcher's design and makes sure that the participants are protected. Okay, well that's enough on chapter 1. So hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you in the next chapter.